Dr. Finney is an assistant professor, I have to look at my notes here, of environmental science, policy, and management at the University of California, Berkeley. She kind of got to where she was by a sort of a roundabout route. Since this is environmental history, this is the scenic route. She grew up on a 13-acre estate in Mamaroneck, New York. All right, I'm not going to give away anything. Her parents were, okay, I'm not going to say anything about her parents. Just think, Mamaroneck, New York, 13-acre estate. Moving along. Like most precocious young people, she went to college, decided it was not for her, so she dropped out and decided to become an actress. For 12 years, you know, all the parents in the audience are going, oh, yeah. For 12 years, she was a working actress. She worked, did stage acting in New York City, then moved to Los Angeles, acted in commercials, got small, sometimes recurring roles on television programs. I don't know, would you say you lived a decent, yeah, it was a way to live, all right. In addition, while she was an actress, she also became interested in backpacking, and notably, she took one backpacking trip across Africa and Asia, during which she decided maybe it was time to give up acting and maybe do a little bit of reevaluation. So she did what we all would do. She sort of left it all behind and lived for 18 months in Nepal. In Nepal, sort of living there among the people, she noticed, and talking to the locals, how she paid attention to the lives of the women, the Nepalese women, and how they had to do all these things like make sure that their families had food and water and other sort of biological and economic necessities, while at the same time maintaining a strict sort of gender identity. Well, when she sort of observed all these kinds of things, something clicked for her, and she decided that it was time to come back to the United States and go to school to get her degree. She enrolled at Fairhaven College in Washington State, primarily because, as she said, she could formulate her own degree program, which included a 6-month foreign exchange student term in Kenya. Right? After that, she enrolled in graduate school at Utah State University, intending to write on and develop a long-term research project on Nepal, its environmental history, and the role of gender. She was accepted to the PhD program at Clark University in Massachusetts, and while she was there, maybe she can talk a little bit about this, she decided to switch topics and instead focus on a topic that was perhaps for her a little bit closer to home, and that was the sort of interaction between African Americans in this country and the environment, and especially natural spaces. Her research combines approaches from environmental history, cultural studies, to investigate the relationship between place, race, and identity in the United States, especially as they relate to natural resource management and African American participation in the environmental movement. Her book, which came out a couple of years ago, and which is why we... Did I say a couple of years ago? I'm probably just thinking about my own book, because you know how scholars are. Yeah, not even a year ago. Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, which came out in 2014, published by the University of North Carolina Press, examines how natural spaces were understood, represented, and commodified by both black and white Americans to determine who can and should have access to those spaces. She explores the role of memory and identity in African American environmental participation and the differences regarding perceived exclusion and racism between black and white environmentalists. And by the way, this book is extremely popular now, which is why it took so long, or took a little bit of juggling for us to get us here. For a little bit of a taste, if you just can't get enough of Dr. Finney after this, you can go to the STS website or to her website and see her interview with Tavis Smiley on PBS. This is very, very good, very entertaining. Tonight, she will tell us a little bit about her work. Her talk is called Crying the Bones, Singing the Bones, Environmental History, Race, and Dreaming into the Future. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Carolyn Finney.
No? Now? All right. All is good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. First, let me thank. I got to think too, but let me thank. I want to thank John, Dr. Powers, Karen, Dr. Rader, Wanda Cleary, because they made it really possible. Those are the three people I've been dealing with to help me get here and be here, which is really important, and everybody else, actually, who also made it possible for me to be here today. Oh my gosh, it's so weird when somebody introduces you and they start rattling off your stuff and you're just like, man, you just like revealed my stuff, you know, in front of everybody, but it's okay, you get a kind of a sense of who I am, and yeah, I get reminded too. So I'm gonna do a couple of things today. I'm gonna use my book to actually talk about some of the issues I want to talk about around race and environmental history, particularly here in the United States. And one of the ways I like to do that, I use stories actually to get at some of those issues. I don't like to actually stand in front of an audience. I could spout out theoretical blah, blah, blahs, but actually the thing that people remember are the stories and trying to make those connections in those stories and a larger idea. So that's partially what I want to do today. I want to tell you a little bit about this picture. So every time I come to speak for somebody, I try to think about something about the place I'm coming to and the people I'm speaking to. Actually, this picture is taken, I took this picture back in November in North Carolina. It was actually the first time I had been to North Carolina. I was speaking, a group called the Conservation Trust of North Carolina had brought me in. And historic Stagville, that's what it's called, historic Stagville, this is very particularly called the Horton Grove Nature Preserve. That's right next to it. But historic Stagville is the largest antebellum plantation in North Carolina. But what's interesting is that one of the parties that actually takes care of this space is a nature conservancy. And this used to be 30,000 acres. And so what we did on that day when I showed up, before I spoke, they said, we're going to take you on a little walk. They took us a walk on this, like part of the 700-acre nature preserve, and there was somebody talking about the wildflowers and the trees and everything about that space. And then we kind of went right down the road next door to where there were some existing slave cabins and talk a little bit about this. What's very interesting for me about this particular house, and you're not going to see it too well, I took a picture of it anyway and put it up there, but what the arrow is pointing to, it's actually a child's footprint. So this brick part of that chimney was made by enslaved Africans, and they pointed out, the person talking about the site showed us the child's footprint in the brick wall. And so I think a lot about, you know, and a lot of the way I talk about environment and race and place, the way that certain stories show up, the way other stories don't. And I thought it was really interesting the way the Conservancy had us first talk about the landscape and the character of the landscape, and then showed us the character of some of the stories and the history in that place. So I kind of want to keep that feeling in the air. It was really interesting to get up close and imagine that this child's parents were making this, and they probably stepped in there by accident, but that they were also enslaved at the time. So I call this my metaphorical afro, and I always, you know, have my metaphorical afro around, and just in case you think that I just pulled that metaphorical afro from nowhere. I used to actually have a real afro a lot of years ago. So, you know, I'm kind of looking at my notes, and I know I'm going to jump around. I can tell it's happening already. The one thing I want to be sure to say is that my PhD is in geography. It's important for me to say that. So why we do what we do, where we do it, people in place. But I also have this heavy artistic background, you know, I sort of come from that place. So actually, I use an interdisciplinary lens to understand anything I do. So I have this academic thing about the geography stuff. It's like playing around up there, but sort of my heart is sort of 1 foot firmly in the humanities and the arts as well, and I pull on that as well. So I call this my creativity at the crossroads. So people are talking to me. So one of the many things that I do is I serve on a lot of predominantly white environmental organizations, their boards as advisors. I'm on the National Parks Advisory Board and a lot of other groups that I work with that are actively trying to engage diverse communities of color. They're trying to do that. You can ask me later whether or not how well I think they're doing and what some of the challenges are, because I do have some answers to that. And one of the things that they're always talking about, we're in a time of great transition, right? We're in a great time of environmental transition, whether or not we own climate change or not, things are actually happening out there. Where great social demographic change is happening. Though every time everybody says that about greater diversity, I'm always going, you know what, things were always changing. I think it's much more complex now than ever. I think we're forced to deal with it now more than ever. But really, how are we going to show up to this moment? And I'm thinking a lot, when I call it creativity at the crossroads, as somebody who works in academia, and I was telling folks earlier, I never say I'm an academic. I say I work in academia for me. It's very specific. And what does that mean in terms of how we do our work? When we talk about producing knowledge, when we talk about science, when I always ask the question, who gets to produce that knowledge? What kind of knowledge counts? When we talk about our methodology, what are we trying to get at? What is it that we're trying to do different to understand this transition? So I think there's something about being creative, but I think we're at a kind of crossroads around it. I mean, I feel this for myself personally, but I also see it in my department. I see it in other spaces as well, about how are we going to show up at this moment. And I'm also seeing the kind of resistance to change, because and it's happening for me in every sector: politics, government, academia, the people that do not want things to change. And I have a lot of compassion actually for that, because change is really scary. But I'm also kind of tired of that, because actually it is time for things to change. So what can we do, especially those of us in positions of privilege, like being in the academy, to make those changes? So I always like to put this slide up here, because when I think about history, when I think about environmental history, when I think about issues of race and difference more broadly, you know, for me, how all these things kind of come together. The reality is they've always been there, always together, but we don't always talk about them that way, because it makes it much more complicated to talk about it, which is why I'll put up pictures of, you know, an enslaved person in Japanese internment, Gifford Pinchot, John Muir, immigration, people being poor. I mean, just all of these things have always been there at the same time. It is often interesting to me, as somebody who's come up through school, how we have a real linear conversation about it. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And there's often a dominant narrative about something happening. So if we talk about John Muir around 1875, thinking about the idea of preservation, we're going to protect these wild spaces. And I'm also thinking about the native people who had to be removed from them, and the enslaved Africans who were no longer enslaved but could not participate in being in these spaces. These things are happening at the same time. When Gifford Pinchot is talking about the idea of conservation, when he's coming up with the idea of forestry and management, I think this is a great idea. And he's doing this, but we're living under Jim Crow segregation, which means everybody cannot participate at the same time in this. And all these things are going on at the same time. And there's a legacy of all of these things happening at the same time. I don't think I have to tell anybody in this room that, but I'm interested about how we stand within the tension of that complexity and deal with that. We cannot talk about one thing without talking about the other. It is so surprising to me how I'll be in a room and I might have a biologist, for instance, say, I don't know why I have to be here to talk about this, because this isn't part of what I do. Or somebody from another sector or discipline or experience that feels like that they shouldn't have to engage this, or they don't know how to engage this. And I want to really challenge that, because I believe that's a privilege actually to shut that out. And I think we have to figure out how we're going to lean really hard into this, because it's coming. For some of us, it's always been here. So, I don't know, I found this, I kind of like that. But I just made that one. But, because I'm thinking about the idea of convergence. I call this section embodied knowledge, practice, and praxis, right? And I think about what I call the politics of placemaking, the idea of embodied experience, knowledge production, and storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I don't just mean that we sit and tell a story to each other, but I think actually that all of us in this room who do any kind of knowledge production are always producing story. It's always funny to me, what's considered to be a narrative? I think all of what we do is narrative. I don't care how technical it is, how quote unquote scientific it is, how humanities-based it is a story. And those stories take hold in a very particular way, right? They inform policy, they inform everything that it is we do. So how do we really pull back the curtain on that, ask the question of who gets to participate in that? Whose knowledge counts? When I say embodied knowledge, it's because I like to think all of us in this room actually have knowledge. We have something just from living our lives as who we are. But not all of us get to participate in knowledge production in the same way. When I started research on African Americans and environment as a graduate student, and the reason I switched over actually was because there was a political unrest in Nepal and I couldn't finish my work there. At Clark University, there were no African American studies classes. I've never taken an African American studies class. Ever, because none of the places I were at had any, number one. Also, I went to the library shelves, and I wanted to find stuff on African Americans and the environment, and there wasn't very much there. And I started to think about, I actually have to get creative now at thinking about where that knowledge is. And it's really, and make the case for it, because not only you get creative, but you know in school you have to make the case, and you have to make the case well. And I had to make the case about that our knowledge isn't only found on the library shelves. It's also in our memoirs, it's in our songs, it's in our music, it's in our storytelling. And those things shouldn't be just anecdotes or extras, they're actually equal to the more formal information we find in academic institutions. So how do we do our work and engage that and honor that work in a way that I believe would be appropriate? And finally, the last thing I want to say about that piece is, also, how do we evaluate it? You know, because it's not legible to everybody. Right? So how do we make it legible to everybody? What does that actually look like? When we talk about standards and rigor, what do we actually mean? So you're all wondering what he's got to do with everything, and I'm going to tell you. Has anybody heard of Jack Andreka? I love that. So when you have some time, you got to put his name in and look at it as a video on YouTube. He's actually done TED Talks and everything. About a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I was watching 60 Minutes. And they had him on there. At the time, he was 16 years old. He had just won the largest science prize in the country, the Intel Science Prize, for $100,000. When he was in 10th grade, he had recently had a family member die from pancreatic cancer. And many of us know that pancreatic cancer is one of the most hardest cancers to actually diagnose because there's no early detection program. So the dude is sitting in 5th period biology when he's not paying attention to his biology teacher, and instead he comes up with an early detection program. He puts together a proposal. He sends it out to 200 labs across the country. 199 turn him down. The 200th one at Johns Hopkins says, you have something here. So this is the moment, and you can find it on YouTube, when he finds out that he won. He is so shocked and surprised that he won. So Morley Safer, the reason I put him up there is because Morley Safer is talking to him and saying, I want to get the quote right, is asking him about, you must be really smart that you came up with this. Isn't this amazing? And this is what Jack Andreka says. He says, quote, I don't think it's that I'm really smart. I mean, I know people who are way smarter than me. You can be a genius, but if you don't have the creativity to put that knowledge to use, then you just have a bunch of knowledge and nothing else. He was 16 when he said that. I wrote it down. I was like, dang, and I hope he doesn't lose that, because that gave him the freedom to think out of the box about that he could sit in 5th period biology and come up with this idea and push it farther. And I think often how we can get really institutionalized to not taking those creative risks anymore. And what is that limit? What are we missing out by not doing that? Bam. So I'm also thinking about an idea I sort of called radical presence, right? I'm trying to, when I'm doing work on African Americans as a black person, or any person that feels that as part of the dominant culture that they're sort of marginalized within that culture, there's often a way that I found that looking at black people has been how black people have been victimized. It's sort of coming from that angle, and it's not that black people haven't been victimized, but actually we are more than our victimization, right? That we actually have ideas, and we're not always responding, we're often proactive about our creativity, as many groups of people are. And I think about radical presence. So I'd recently heard about Ron Finley. If you haven't heard about him, he's also done TED Talks. I read about something about him in the New York Times. He calls himself a guerrilla gardener, and that's his quote, "You ain't gangsta unless you're planting something." He's based in LA, and what he does, he literally plants on highway medians. He plants and grows food anywhere that he can find a space to do so. And he's really, he challenges sort of the traditional idea who's doing gardening, who's doing sustainable kind of work, and he uses his own language, his own way of being, his own identity, and he carves out that place. You know, for me, that's an idea of something called radical presence. Someone who's there, someone who's always been there, but they're there doing what they do in spite of the rules and regulations and the way in which they could be dismissed and be made invisible in the larger public, particularly when we're talking about the environment. So I'm back to my metaphorical afro. So I always have a lot of different people bumping up in my head, but when I was focused very specifically on African American, so everybody I put up here happens to be African American. Just because, you know, I gotta put it up there again. She gets lonely. So Nikki Giovanni, most of you I hope have heard of Nikki Giovanni, is a well-known African American poet. She's right up here. About a year and a half or two ago, she came to Oakland and gave a talk about one of her books. And one of the things that stuck with me that she said is, she said, we have to be able to learn different literacies. Sailors can read the you know, farmers can read the soil. We have to learn different literacies. So I've been thinking a lot about that, what that means in terms of a lot of the work that we do and how we do our work. Maybe 4 years ago at the University of Minnesota, I went to a conference called Black Environmental Thought 2. And I always say, I didn't know there had been a Black Environmental Thought 1. Well, there was a Black Environmental Thought 2 conference. And this woman is Bernice Reagan Johnson. Now, you might not know who she is just by her name, but she was the founding member of the singing group Sweet Honey in the Rock. But she also has her PhD. She's worked for many years at the Smithsonian and American University doing work on African American history. And so she was the keynote, and she was really surprised to be the keynote. And she even said so, that she was so surprised at a Black Environmental Thought 2 conference. But one of the things that she said that stuck with me is that you have to go below the intellectual paper record to get those stories. And I really found these were sort of affirmations and justifications and clarifications about how I needed to move forward with my work. This idea that if I just stuck with the paper record, and the paper record is quite powerful, and so I'm not dismissing it, that's not what I'm saying, but there's a whole lot of other stories and experience there that's embedded, and so I want to find those stories. Finally, there's a lot of great people up there that I love. I want to, Jackie Moms Mabley, some of the older folks in the room know who Jackie Moms Mabley is. So Jackie Moms Mabley was a comedian. She came out of vaudeville, so in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. One of the amazing things about, that's what she looks like, but she would get in front of predominantly white audiences in the 50s and 60s. She'd take out her teeth, she'd put on that hat and that schmata, and she'd be up there talking about race. This is incredible if you think about, she was doing this in the 50s and 60s. She was so popular, she got invited to the White House, right? They just loved her, taking out her teeth and talking about race, telling the truth to a room of predominantly white people, and they would love her for that. Whoopi Goldberg, in the last maybe year or two, HBO came out with a new movie about her life. And Arsenio Hall was on there getting interviewed about her. Arsenio Hall, the comedian, was getting interviewed about her. And the interviewer asked Arsenio, how do you think she was able to do that? How did she get away with that in the 50s and 60s? And he said, oh, well, she was sneaking it through the back door. So because I talk to a lot of different audiences around race and difference, what does that look like in terms of creatively how we do our work? How do we sneak it through the back door? And I'm not talking about being dishonest, but I'm talking about in terms of rigor. What does that look like? What does that look like methodology? What does that look like with how we show up? Because we need to show up, right? We need to continually show up and have these conversations. So, black faces, white spaces. Reimagine the relationship of African Americans to the great outdoors. So, you know, funny thing when you go to school and you start learning all this stuff, and when I showed up in my PhD, you know, I thought I knew what I was going to do. I was going to still look at gender, conservation issues in Nepal. You know, I got my Fulbright, I was over there, and then life happens while you're busy making plans. Royal family got assassinated, there was political unrest. I couldn't get to where I was going to do my work. But when I started the PhD and all the reading that I was doing, I really started thinking about African Americans. I started thinking about race and environment right here at home, and wondering how I might start to look at that. And while this was in many ways an intellectual project, what I tell everybody is that it was a personal project. I mean, I understood, you know, I was using my intellect and my skills to actually do the research and the work, but I was motivated to do it because it was personal. And so this was a story that John almost gave away, Dr. John, but I can give it up now. The other thing I want to say, and I always feel that I have to tell the story, is because I believe, and not everyone's going to agree with me, that's okay, that all knowledge is subjective, that we bring all of who we are to bear upon any we're trying to understand. You know, I can't just stand up in a room and talk about African Americans and be like, and yes, I am black. And so that means I bring a particular perspective to that. I'm not going to pretend I don't. I'm not talking from some objective place. You know, I also bring that to bear upon it. So my parents are originally from the state of Virginia. My parents grew up in Virginia, down near Roanoke. My father went off to the Korean War in the 50s. When he came back from the Korean War, you know, he needed to get a job. And they were black in the South in the 50s, and a lot of black people in the South in the 50s. They said, we're going north. He said, let's move to New York. We might have a better opportunity. When he got to New York, my father had 2 job offers. One, he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York. Syracuse is about 5 hours north of New York City. And the other is about 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County. It was a 12-acre, 13-acre estate in Westchester County, owned by a very wealthy Jewish family called the Tishmans. If you've ever been to New York City and seen the Tishman building, they own a lot of real estate, including Rockefeller Center. So they have a 12-acre estate, gardens, you know, peach tree, apple trees, a lake, a swimming pool, flower gardens, and what I like to call the big house that the Tishmans came to on weekends and holidays, and the gardener's cottage. That is the gardener's cottage. I don't even have a picture of the big house here. So my parents took this job. My father was the chauffeur, the gardener. My mom was the sometime housekeeper, and they had to live full-time on this property. Thought they couldn't have kids, so they adopted me. And then what I always say, then they relaxed, and 2 years later, my first brother was born, and a few years after that, my second brother was born. The neighborhood is a wealthy, very wealthy, all-white neighborhood. When I say very wealthy, Harry Winston has property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer lived next door. I always say Schaefer Beer, man. That was just not good beer. But anyway, they had a lot of money. And the Tishmans came up on weekends and holidays, so my brothers, we had run. This was like we were playing outside all the time. This is where we were all the time. The story that I tell people in terms of when I think I really started to get a sense about the color of our skin and the neighborhood we were living in, and how some folks didn't feel it was natural for us to be there, is when I was 9 years old. I was walking home from school one day looking highly unimpressive with my little afro and my reading glasses. There were always cops. I was right around the corner from the house. Cop stopped me, wanted to know where I was going. I told him 1000 Old White Plains Road, which is the address. And he said, oh, do you work there? And I'm thinking, I'm 9 years old, right? But I don't say anything. And I said, no, I live there. And he let me go. I go home. I tell my parents. My father calls the cops, gives them a hard time. They never stop me and my brothers again. But there were a lot of instances like this, the moments where I thought, boy, it's kind of odd for us to be here. And it wasn't until I got older and could really reflect on it, what it meant. Because the other thing about Mamaroneck, we sat at the top of a hill is where all the nice houses are and the really big yards and the estates. If you go down into the village of Mamaroneck is where the working class African Americans and working class Italians live. So there's real separation that we all went to the same schools. So there was a lot of things I dealt with too, but I can come back to that. I was bullied by Mary Mitchell, Darlene Robinson for years. That's another story. So the last thing I want to say about this, and I'll come back to it at the very end. In 2002, 2003. So Mr. Tishman died a long time ago in the 60s. Mrs. Tishman in the 90s knew she was getting sick, and I call them Mr. and Mrs. Tishman, and that's a whole thing. But up until a few years ago, I'd still get a Christmas card with $50 in it. That's a story I'm here to tell you. But, and I used the $50 and sent my thank you card, because I was raised right. So Mrs. Tishman got sick, knew that she was going to die. What was going to happen to my parents? My parents had been caring for this land for almost 50 years, right? To her credit, she wanted to keep my parents on this property. At the time in the 90s, this property was worth over $3 million. The property taxes alone were $125,000 a year. My father had been making about $20,000 a year. So in the end, it wasn't going to work for them to stay here. So she had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia. My father swore he was never coming back to this state. He has a lot of bitterness about growing up here, so he calls it Sleesburg. It's a beautiful house on a half an acre of land. Mrs. Tishman, and the closeness of Mrs. Tishman and my father, I always think it's a little bit like driving Miss Daisy. He would hate it if he heard me say it. Mrs. Tishman had my father by her bedside, you know, when she was dying. They moved down in 2003. She died. New owner came on the property. My parents stayed on until 2003. They helped to train and usher in a new family, which is from Latin America, who now lives in the house, which is really interesting. And since 2003, my parents have been depressed. My father has been incredibly depressed. He talks about missing the place, missing the land. And this is about that time I started thinking about, ownership. Whose ownership counts? My folks have cared for this land for 50 years. They know it better than anybody else, but actually they have no power in determining what happens on that land and how they get to stay there. Then I started thinking about the history of this country, all the people that are invisible in the conversation about the environment and place and land, who have always been there, are still there, who interact with that land in very particular ways, but are often seen as invisible, not engaged in. My parents would never call themselves environmentalists. My parents are way more skilled than I will ever be in terms of working at and understanding the land and nature. I can talk about it, but I can't grow a thing. You know what I'm saying? And so I think about my father and my mother and all the people like that who aren't included in the conversation. And that's why I wanted to tell the story, and particularly on African Americans. I got really tired of hearing African Americans don't fill in the blanks, camp, swim, hike, care or think about the environment. I pointed out actually the highest voting bloc on the environment are African Americans, which is really interesting. Ooh, I got feelings, yes. So I'm sort of go through this a little bit chapter by chapter, piece by piece, but I'll try to not talk so much. I can get really carried away on this stuff. So one of the things that I wanted to do was, I thought I want to write a book. It has to be an academic book, but I wanted to write it so that it's accessible, because a big part of my work is public engagement. And for me to walk my talk, I had to write it in a way that a lot of folks can engage with it, because I work with a lot of environmental organizations. Also, because everything that I was looking for wasn't on the library shelves. Yes, I use a lot of theory. I refer to Carolyn Merchant and a lot of great folks who've done a lot of great work. But I wanted to have a lot of black voices in there. And I found that a lot of that stuff was from memoirs and diaries and, again, oral history. And I wanted to pull that in, too, and from the art world. So one of the things I did was borrowed from Spike Lee. So a couple of my chapters are specifically named after movies he's made. And so the first chapter was Bamboozled. And for those of you who have never seen his movie Bamboozled, it was looking at the media industry and how we've been bamboozled into thinking about African American representation in a very particular way. Now, I'm not talking about the media here, but I am talking about how we've been bamboozled when I think about the history of land and land ownership in this country. So have any of you ever seen the movie Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman? I didn't love that movie, but what I like about the movie is the last 20 minutes. So the Homestead Act, what I think is one of our most important pieces of legislation in this country, which I knew nothing about until maybe 10 years ago. In 1862, it meant that if you were a European immigrant, what you could do, the gun went off at midnight or whatever, you could run out, you could put your stake down on 160 acres of land if you could get there. And if you could stay on it for 5 years, if you could build a structure, and if you gardened or farmed on there and you survived it, it was yours free and clear. This is incredible. I don't think this happens anywhere anymore in the world, that you can get that land for free. Right? And I'm not saying it wasn't hard stuff, because a lot of European immigrants died. I think it's something like 60% of the people who originally did it didn't make it. This has got to be isolating, backbreaking work in the 1800s, man. The closest doctor might be 100 miles away. If you caught a cold, you could die. I can't imagine how lonely it must have been. And many of these European immigrants were running away from really difficult time at home in Europe. So I'm not painting them to be bad. I mean, they were doing their thing. They had an opportunity. I get it. And I also say, who are the people that had to be removed from the land in order for European immigrants to get that land? What does that mean? And I mean removed from the land, not asked nicely, right? The native people. And I think about, so in 1862, you had the Homestead Act, and just 3 years later, enslaved Africans were freed, were given 400,000 acres. And then why plantation owners kind of got nervous and said, what are we doing? Because land isn't just about having land, it's about economic and political power, and understanding if you have land, you also get political and economic power. And they took those 400,000 acres back, and most of those African Americans could not participate in the Homestead Act. So these two things are happening at the same time. So this is one of the places for me I feel we've been bamboozled. Ooh, because then I get carried away, and it's like, what am I saying? Yes, America's identity, okay. Next chapter. Yes, indeed, jungle fever. And I mean that in all kinds of the ways. I mean, Spike Lee was talking about interracial relationships, and I'm thinking about, And in my own way, looking at, I have the quote up, this idea about how nature has was sort of historically created and understood dominantly in this country, the way we talk about it. But I kind of want to point to a few things. So I have these two images up here because I talk a lot about the power of representation and images. And images tell their own story, and the legacy of how we've been talking about black and brown people in the past plays out in the present. So most of you probably remember this. This was 2010, right? Vogue. It's the first time an African-American man had ever been placed on the cover of Vogue magazine. LeBron James with the supermodel Gisele Bündchen. When that came out, people went crazy on the blogosphere and the internet. Especially black people were really upset because they were saying, you finally put a black man on the cover, and why does the dude look like a big gorilla? He's like, looking all animalistic. This is really problematic. Then somebody uncovered this. This is from 1917, right down to the color of her dress, how close it was. And they took it to the editors, and they said, were you trying to copy what's here? And the editors said, no. I don't know if I believe that. But for me, it's even less important about whether or not they were aware of it and did it intentionally, because even if they didn't, it's something about how it's embedded in our consciousness. In the 1800s, in the late 1800s and early 1900s in this country, we were having World's Fairs. We were having World's Fairs partially to sort of build a sense of who we are, our American identity, what it is we want to evolve to. And black and brown people were put on display because black and brown people were considered the thing we want to move away from. Black and brown people were talking about being close to nature, but being close to nature wasn't a compliment. It was about being the missing link. It was about being sort of animal-like. I think about, and we have so many stories like this. I will tell the one about Ota Benga. Ota Benga was a young African man who was discovered, I want to say he was like 20, 21. He was discovered in the Congo, I believe 1903. He was brought back to the United States. He was put on display in the Museum of Natural History in New York because he was considered to be like the missing link. And because the Museum of Natural History thought we can't get enough of the public in to see him, we're going to move him to the primate exhibit in the Bronx Zoo. And this is just one of many stories like this, right? So when I start to see a picture like this, because some people were saying, well, why are black people getting so upset? Oh, there's, when President Obama came up with the stimulus bill a few years back, Sean Delonis is a cartoonist, and it was either for the New York Daily News or the New York Post. He made a cartoon. The cartoon was a picture of a dead chimp with stimulus bill kind of pinned to his chest, two white cops standing over him with a smoking gun. When Glenn Beck, who's a conservative political talk show host, says Obama's Planet of the Apes, there are so many instances of these references. There's a legacy of these references. They're not just outliers. They're not just something funny. And we start to understand the complicated relationship that African Americans collectively have historically with nature and the environment and where we stand in relation to it, because often we have been painted very negatively in relationship to the environment over time. The other thing that, for me, I tell people this is kind of embarrassing, but the thing is, until maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I'd never thought about the Wilderness Act. I never heard, my family, we never went to national parks. Since I serve on the National Parks Advisory, I've been to a lot of parks now, but I hadn't been to my first national park in the United States until I was in my late 30s. It just never occurred to me. When I was interviewing people, one African-American man in particular reminded me that the Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act happened in the same year. That's incredible because both of those are major pieces of legislation. And you've got two groups of people that aren't talking to each other. They're both working hard on what it is they're doing, but they're not having a conversation right across the aisle about how those things may or may not be connected. The last thing I want to say about this is that a Canadian friend of mine, when I was working on this in about 2006, 2007, sent me an article from a Canadian journal. And it was a Boston professor, a white professor, Dr. DeWolf from Boston College, back in the late 50s, 60s, wanted to take an African-American couple that were friends of his to a national park, but decided that he would take them over the border to Canada, Fundy Bay National Park. But because they're African-American, he said, I'm going to write the folks at Fundy Bay, just making sure they're going to be treated with respect. So he sent a letter explaining how cultured that this couple were and educated that they were, and they should be treated with respect. He waited a while. When he got a response from the superintendent said, I'm sorry, I can't really do anything for you because we get a lot of American visitors up here. The was Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife Coretta Scott King, who wanted to take a break from all their civil rights work to find some spiritual renewal, right, at a national park, something that Howard Zanizer and those guys working on the Wilderness Act would surely understand. But even people of their stature couldn't do that safely and securely and find that place because of what was going on at that time in the United States. I always tell people, I like this because I get to use the picture of Tupac. So I like this, 40 acres and a mule. So one of the things that came up for me in talking to people, interviewing people, was the power of memory. Both collective, and it's something I usually always say at the beginning, that I am not speaking for all African American people. And it's sad, but often, Henry Louis Gates said this, how we have to, the dreaded thing, the dreaded desire to represent, and we're just as diverse as any other group. And I feel like there's some collective things that have happened historically that impact us all in very particular ways. So what came up for me a lot, particularly talking to older African Americans, is the collective power of that memory in terms of how that memory informs the decisions they make today about whether or not to go to a certain space, what it means to go to a national park or not. And also, or any space, actually feeling safe going for a hike in the woods in any neighborhood, and why they might not make the choice to do so. I can't tell you how many times lynching came up, how many times that just came up, this idea we get lynched in the woods. It's not the four-legged creature we need to be afraid of, it's the two-legged. I mean, these things that come up over and over again as part of the response. And so also for people individually, one of the stories I like to tell is that I was living in Atlanta 2004, 2005 when I was writing this up as a dissertation. And I got my parents to come visit me, which was kind of a big deal because I can't get my parents to come visit me anywhere. And I said, well, I'm going to take them on like the Black Atlanta thing, right? And so we went to Dr. Martin Luther King National Park. I don't know if any of you have ever gone, but it's one of the national parks that's right in the middle of a city. So people live on that street. You have Ebenezer Baptist Church where Dr. King used to preach. You have the house he grew up in, and you have the visitor center. And so when you go into the visitor center, they have these things called dioramas set up. And so this idea is supposed to sort of alt your senses with what it must have felt like in the 50s and 60s to actually be there. There's all these black and white images of people protesting and signs. There's sounds of Dr. King and other voices coming over the loudspeaker. There's life-size statues of people marching. There's a replica of a jail cell there where Dr. King must have spent some time. So you're just getting it from all angles. So I'm standing with my dad looking at one of these sets of images. And my dad, Henry Finney, so this is a little side story. So his full name is Henry Lee Finney. But for the longest time, in the 60s, he was going to change all of our names to African names. It never happened. He hated the middle name Lee because he was sure it was after Robert E. Lee, right? So sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, he came to me and my brothers, can I change my name? How do I do it? And we told him how you go about it. So he officially changed his middle name. So his name is now Henry X. Finney. That's some of the coolest stuff. I said, Dad, he calls himself the most radical black man in America. It's not true, but that was pretty cool, I thought. So I'm standing with my dad. He's old school, conservative, hardcore dude. He's standing there. The emotion he shows is just anger. He never shows any vulnerability. And suddenly, can I borrow you? He comes over and he's standing next to me and he grabs my arm. And I looked at him and he had blanched. And so what I thought was happening was that he was having a heart attack. Because it was, my father never grabs, there's not looking for help from me, and I saw that happen. And about 2 seconds later, after he blanched, he giggled. And I tell everybody that freaked me out even more than the blanching, because my dad does not giggle, okay? And I said, are you okay? And he said, he looked kind of embarrassed. And he said, yeah, he says, and he pointed to, and it was a sign, a replica of a sign that said, for whites only. And he pointed to the sign, he said, I looked at that sign, and for a minute, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. His memory had taken him back that fast, like 40 years. And it moved me so much about it. How memories are embedded in our consciousness and in ourselves, so even if we don't call on it on a daily basis, it can remind us in certain moments how it's there. The other reason I like to talk about memories is because there were African Americans I met who used that as part of their environmental work, the way they kind of came to it. And I'm so excited, because we were just talking, and I can't even believe he is from this place. We were talking about this earlier, because that never has happened to me in an audience. So has anybody, besides him, you can't say anything, have any of you heard of Maureen Betch? She's known as the Beach Lady. Oh, yes, I know you must, right? So a lot of people have heard of her sister, which is Dr. Jonetta Cole, because she's kind of well known in academic circles. So Maureen grew up on Amelia Island, right off the coast of Jacksonville, Florida, 40s and 50s. Her great-grandfather was A.L. Lewis. He was the first man, black or white, to have a life insurance company in Jacksonville at that time. And so he made a lot of money. What was also true, I mean, she grew up in an economically privileged family, but what was still true, black people could not go to the same beaches as white people at that time in Florida. So her great-grandfather, A.L. Lewis, said, we can't go to the same beach, I'm gonna buy a beach. So he did. He bought a strip of beach on Amelia Island, he called it American Beach. So now you could have janitors, could have a home on the beach next door, black janitors could have a home next to a black judge living on the beach. And this is where Maveen grew up. Maveen went to Oberlin Conservatory, she wanted to be an opera singer, and then she took off and went to Germany. She spent a number of years there and she was fairly successful. But sometime in the 70s, she got really interested in environmental causes. First, she was supporting the scientist who was studying the monarch butterfly. She would send her money to organizations that were working with pygmy communities in Africa. She gave away all wealth to environmental causes, over $750,000. She gave away the house that had been bequeathed to her by her great-grandfather, and she lived for a while on a chaise lounge on the beach. She told me, I said, weren't you afraid? She said, I always had a big stick, and I would scare people. Just to give you some idea of Maveen, that she's holding are her dreadlocks. They are so long that she has them up in a net like that. So Maveen was first interested in environmental issues going out there in the world, but then she looked at what was happening on American Beach. This is prime beachfront property. It sits between Fernandina Beach, right, which is kind of a resort community, but then there's Amelia Island Plantation also next door. You have a maritime forest, this beautiful beachfront property. Developers are salivating and want to come in and put another golf course or whatever it is they wanted to do, and she's like, it's not going to happen. She was going to protect it. She tells me how she would go to civic meetings all about the beach and the developing, and she was standing in back of the room. And the minute she would tell me, I'd be like, what, like you weren't going to be noticed? But she said, yeah. She's in the back of the room. She said they would do the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to watch the mic there. She would say, I pledge of allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which we stand, one nation, under God, indivisible. And then she would shout it at the top of her lungs, for all white people who got money, with liberty and justice for all. And she said, and she'd be like, and I'd get their attention. I'm like, you had their attention, right, when you walked through the door. Maveen managed to, along with the National Park Service, get them to protect 8.2 acres of the sand dunes that are part of the beach, which she's standing in front of here. This is a National Historical Site. She became known as the Beach Lady. One of the things that stuck with me about Maveen was that she said to me, I am the freest person you will ever meet. She said, because when I gave away the money, I was able to do exactly what I needed to do. I have been in so many rooms like this, especially when I've gone to environmental organizations, and almost nobody has ever heard about her. There's been book written, articles, 2 movies made, and this is the question for me. Why heard? This is an incredible story about a black woman who gave away all her wealth to environmental causes. A few months after Hurricane Katrina, she passed away. She had been fighting stomach cancer for some time, but her legacy lives on. I have 2 plants that she gave me from American Beach. Every time I move, I have my little Maveen plants with me. I know she's watching me, and I know she'll kick my butt if I don't get it right. How am I doing on time? Oh, okay. That's not good. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to hop to the story here. So again, I look at, particularly in this chapter, I look at representation, but I literally decided to count. I think sometimes if you just go through magazines and count how many times you see African Americans. I'm going to skip this for a second just for the sake of time. But I have been getting Outside Magazine for years. It's been around 25, 30 years. It comes out every month. Adventure travel, backpacking, environmental stuff. I said, oh, this comes out every month. I'm going to literally count. I'm going to take 10 years worth of this magazine, 91 to 2001, and see how many times African Americans show up. Is it a man, woman, or child? And can we tell if the setting is urban, rural, or suburban? And what are they doing in that? So in those 10 years worth, I counted a little over 6,000 pictures, a little over 4,600 pictures of people. There were about 103 pictures of African Americans, almost all of them famous male black sports figures in urban settings. Almost every single one, right? Which I think is really interesting. The last thing I want to say, and because it's only fairness to say this about Outside, about 2 years ago, they decided to actually do an article about that. And so, because they used that number and they got about 6 different people of color conversation about magazines like this being too white and how they represent and who they represent. So I think that's really great they decided to have that conversation. I'm going to leave Vanity Fair out for now. I want to talk about the issue of representation. Because again, it's whose stories do we see? Who do we think is doing anything having to do with the environment? How many of you have heard of John Francis? I mean, I both like when that happens because it's great when you're giving the talk, but it's also like the thing that, it's like, how can you not heard of John Francis? You got homework to do. So John Francis in the 70s lived in Northern California. There was a small oil spill there. It upset him so much, John said he decided he wasn't going to take any motorized transport just for a while. He said he did it for like a week or two, but then he was always getting into arguments with people because, you know, they'd be like, get in my car, why are you doing that, that sort of thing. So he stopped talking about it. For 22 years, John walked across the US and Latin America to raise awareness about the environment. He did it for 17 years without talking. He got his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison without talking. On the day of his dissertation defense, he started talking. Okay, I just said a moment, right? 22 years to raise environmental awareness, 17 years without talking. John started an organization which he has now called Planet Walk. One of the many things he's done with that group, he's taken a group of people to Cuba, had satellite systems set up so that school kids in Cuba could talk with school kids here about some of the environmental issues going down. He said when he was still walking, but he was talking, I always have to get it right, he was walking and talking, somebody approached him from National Geographic way back about putting his story in National Geographic magazines. It sounds like it would be a great story about this man walking across the United States. About a week later, he said the guy came back kind of sheepishly. He said he had taken the idea to the board, but the board basically didn't want to do a story about a crazy black man. I want to say what goes around comes around because it's really interesting. So he self-publishes his story about doing this because he couldn't find a publisher. In the early 2000s, National Geographic found the story, decided to republish it themselves. Now he's one of their his geographic explorers. They send him to China and all over the world to talk. Hollywood bought the rights to the story. They started talking about, when I first started talking to John about it, he said they were thinking about Will Smith. I got real excited. I was like, if Morgan Freeman plays your dad, I'm on set. Now it's Chiwetel Ejiofor after 12 Years a Slave. I don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes when I tell the audience, I say, so there's going to be this movie, right, out of Hollywood about a black man. And they said, well, they're going to ruin the story. And I said, when is the last time you've seen a movie about a black man who walked 22 years across the United States and Latin America to raise awareness about the environment? I don't care who's making the movie. I said, you're going to put that story in the theater. You're going to get all kinds of people who are going to come in, especially kids. And yeah, they may come in to see who the star is, but they're also going to see a story about a black man who invested his life in the environment and what he cares in and committed to such an extreme. The fact that, and again, nobody in this room has heard of him, right? And why is that? And I'm not putting that on you. I'm just raising the question why the mainstream environmental movement hasn't picked up the story and used it. We're almost there, I know. Oh my God, we're going to skip this one because, you know, the next one is when I have to talk about racism and diversity, and it's like, oh my God, we're all so tired. We can come back to that because I want to tell some stories. Oh yeah, I got some stories to say about this, but if we have time, you can ask me about it. So in the very last chapter is the Sanctified Church, and I actually borrow that from Zora Neale Hurston, a Zora Neale Hurston book, a piece that she wrote. So I have two poems there. The first is by Richard Wright, who's a black poet. And you know, everybody, this one kind of, the Zora Neale Hurston Let There Be Light kind of speaks for itself, but people often ask me, what did I mean by this one? Let's make a scarecrow, but after we made it, our field grew smaller. One of the things I mentioned in the front of the book is I talk about the idea that we all have agency, right? That we all have choices. We don't all have the same choices at the same time, but we all have agency. Two black psychologists wrote a book in the 60s called Black Rage. And they talked about the 60s being a time of, you know, black power, black is beautiful, sort of claiming black identity in a really positive way. But they asked the question, have we also shrunk our ledge? So if you are a French cinematographer, are you black enough? If you study the environment, are you black enough? Is that a black thing to do? And I can't tell you, I remember also, especially, and this is also younger black folks that I've talked to. I talked to a woman, a college student at Tennessee State, and I remember her even telling me she was into recycling and doing all this environmental work, but all her black friends kept telling her that's a white thing to do. So also these questions that are linked to identity, this idea that certain things that you do, if you engage in particular ways, it belongs to a particular group. And so what does that mean for how that narrative has been constructed over time, and our policies have been constructed over time, that you have another group of people who think that they can't do that thing because it's going to interfere with how they are represented in terms of their identity. This is the last chapter in the book. So when you do an academic book, and a lot of you already know this, you always have to have peer reviewers, right? So you get a lot of feedback. And I happen to know It just worked out that I figured out who both my reviewers are. It happened to be that one was a black man and one was a white man. I was like, ooh, the universe couldn't have played this one better. This is good. And I go through their work, and I like them both. But it's interesting. I just have to say it's just interesting, right? I got looking at their comments. And the white academic, you know, he gave me some great feedback. Things he says, you know, would it be great, what if you wrote a whole chapter about the fear that African Americans experience with the environment? Now, I talk about fear because I mention things like the little things that come up that might inform a black person's choice to be engaged in the environment in a particular way. But I was like, he wants me to write a whole chapter about it, and it really bothered me, and I couldn't figure out, it took me a while to figure out why it bothered me, because again, I didn't want to say, we are not about our fear, the fear is real, but actually I want to get at something else. I said, I really want to get at resilience. So I start this chapter of the Sanctified Church, and I spent about a half page talking about the fear. And I want to read this because it's not my paragraph. It's from a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by a scholar named Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary, and if you ever get a chance to hear her speak, she is just awesome, because she summed it all up in one paragraph. 180 years of the Middle Passage, 246 years of slavery, rape, and abuse, 100 years of illusory freedom, black codes, convict leasing, Jim Crow, all codified by our national institutions, lynching, medical experimentation, redlining, disenfranchisement, grossly unequal treatment in almost every aspect of our society, brutality at the hands of those charged with protecting and serving, being undesirable strangers in the only land we know. During the 385 years since the first of our ancestors were brought here against their will, we have barely had time to catch our collective breath. That we are here at all can be seen as a testament to our willpower, our spiritual strength, and our resilience. And then I want it to be done. I said, because now I want to talk about our resilience. And so the last couple of stories about are more stories of people, African Americans who I think continue to be resilient and creative and are thinking out of the box about their ideas. Brenda Palms Barbara is originally from Denver, Colorado, got her degree in business. About 10 or 15 years ago, she got a call from some folks in Chicago who said, listen, we need your help. We've got a lot of previously incarcerated black men and women. You know, they come out of jail, they can't get a job. Can you think up something? So she comes, and first she starts thinking of things like landscaping, maybe landscape gardening, driving around the elderly. All these ideas, but none of them seemed really sustainable over the long haul. And then she was just having a conversation with somebody, and somebody just randomly talked to her about beekeeping. And she said, that's what we're going to do. We're going to train them to keep bees and make urban honey. Now, I want to remind you, this is on the west side of Chicago. So you could imagine that a lot of people thought she was crazy with this idea. So she made the business Sweet Beginnings. Sweet Beginnings makes urban honey and honey-related products. I've been to the house where the honey's made. The other honey-related products are made off-site. It's a 3-story house on the west side of Chicago, 25 apiaries in the backyard, working girls across the street, folks selling drugs on the corner. I mean, it's all there. It's all happening in the same place. And it's an incredibly successful business. Actually, she's been almost too successful. It's been hard for her to keep up with the demand. She would talk about when she interviews someone, when she'll interview a young man or a young woman, and it's because you're there, it's going to be you. So all you got to do is sit there and look good. You're doing good. So she'll be standing in front of them and say, job, and they'll say, yeah, I like a job. And then she'll say, okay, so you were in jail. And they'll say, yes. And she'll say, well, what were you in jail for? They'll usually say, selling drugs. And then she'll do what I call a dramatic pause. Were you good at it? And usually they say, yeah, until I got caught. And she'll say, well, what were you good at? And they'll say, well, I knew the quality of my product. I understood my customer base. And everything that they reeled off, she said, those are all skills that can be all transferred, right? So for me, what's so interesting about this, and I can talk about this later if we have time and when we're just having a conversation with each other, is this idea about she wasn't bringing them to her table. She wasn't outreaching to them, saying, you're going to learn everything that I know and do, and then you're going to be okay. It's an idea that you actually have something. You have embodied knowledge already. We just got to make sure you're doing something legal with it. But actually, the way you come to the table then is very different, because you get to show up as your full self, because it's also about building that kind of confidence in her people, in the people that are working for her. About maybe 4 years ago, I was invited to come there, and I got to hear one of these young men speak about, what it was like for him to have the job. And he got up in front of everybody, and he had a suit on, and he did look a little uncomfortable, and he had his head bowed, and all he said was, "I never knew green could be so good to me." And it was so powerful. And I remember I still get power every time I think about it, because, his understanding of green now means something wholly different than how it's generally thrown out and used and understood. Brenda didn't understand until a year into her business that she was actually running a green business. She was doing it all intuitively. She wasn't feeding her bees sugar derivatives. She was acting locally. All the little points and fixtures that are supposed to define what it means to be green, she was just making those choices. Now she actively engages this. But nobody would think of Brenda Palms Barber as an environmentalist, right? Which is really interesting to me. Okay, how am I doing? Okay, we're almost there. A man named Pearl Fryer, South Carolina. So the name of the documentary of his life is a man named Pearl. Pearl is the son of a sharecropper, and maybe 30 years ago or so, he and his wife decided they wanted to move to Lumberton, South Carolina. It's a little rural town. It's been economically depressed for some time. And he thought when he got there, he saw that he had a lot of yard. I think he had also about 12 acres. And he wanted to win the garden contest. It was usually a local garden contest. But the word on the street was a black person never won, because the word on the street was that people thought black people don't keep their yards nice. So he was like, oh, really? So he went down to the local plant shop, and he talked to the guy who was throwing out trees and plants in the back. He was throwing them out. He said, "Can I have those? Can you tell me how to take care of those?" And he said, "Yes, you can." Now, you know how committed you have to be for a tree? So everything you see here, he planted it all and then taught himself topiary. So all this is all him. What you see, his wife would say that you would see him on a ladder. It would be midnight. Dude's got a chainsaw. He's on a ladder with a light. He's up there carving the tree, scaring her half to death, I guess. I got to meet Mr. Fryer for the first time in November, because I had seen his film, I'd heard about him, and I talked about him in the book, but he was the only one I had never actually met until I got to see his place and hear what he was doing. What's amazing, he's won multiple awards, local, national, international, for his work. People come from all over the world, but he uses this particularly to talk to kids about education. He uses this opportunity in terms of what he does, what he draws to the community, as a way to talk about change and larger ideas. He's 75 years old. When I showed up, he was still out there. He was working, so I had to follow him around as he's working in the yard. Again, I don't think the mainstream environmental movement would think of engaging him in terms of what it is that he knows, how he's able to show up every day, and what he brings to the table. The last story is the Heidelberg Project in Detroit. What? Tyree Guyton. Now, what's funny about this story, too, at the end, that same reviewer couldn't understand why I put this story in there. He said to me, "This has nothing to do with the environment." I thought that was interesting. It just challenged me, though. So Tyree Guyton is an artist. He's been living in Detroit probably most of his life. And we know Detroit is going through some changes. And over time, for the last 30, 40 years, people have been moving out. There's a lot of empty buildings. And Tyree, he said he got tired of seeing these empty buildings. They're dangerous, so he would turn them into art projects and literally go in and paint them and put polka dots on them and use what he said was throwaway junk stuff to make kind of art. If you go to Detroit, you ask where the Heidelberg Project is. I mean, he has pieces all over the city, but there's actually a few blocks of street where people live on, where a lot of these houses, like this is on Heidelberg Street here, as is that over there in the corner. When I him a few years ago, he took me to this area right here. It's the empty projects. It used to be old projects. There's all this empty land. He's talking about a community garden, a big community art project, and I know he was waiting to try to get permission from the city on this. And he talks a lot about how, for him, he really saw the intersection with about land, place, environment, how we show up, and bringing attention to the buildings. Empty buildings, forgotten buildings means empty and forgotten people as well. And usually these people are predominantly black. Usually they're predominantly poor. And so for him, it was bringing the attention to both those things, but also having the community be involved. And he's at the fight twice. That's the other thing. There's sort of diverse feeling about that. But I like the way of thinking out of the box about the environment and place and land and how you show up. And not everybody's coming at it with their Gore-Tex and their boots and their fleece. And I own all of them. But not everybody comes at it in that way. So finally, yes, there is a finally. I want to come back to the story of my parents. I think I already, no, I didn't say that part. So my parents are in Leesburg, and I was visiting them. This must have been, I don't know, maybe it was 2004 or 2005. And my parents had gotten a letter from one of the neighbors there, and whenever anything happens on that estate, they'll get an update. And the letter was from a group called the Westchester Conservation Trust. And the note was saying that they were thanking the new owner for his conservation mindedness because a conservation easement has now been placed on this estate. And when you have a conservation easement placed on a piece of land, it means that in perpetuity, nothing can be built or changed on that estate. That land is protected. And they were kind of listing off all the good environmental characteristics of this estate, the wildlife on the estate, the type of trees that were there, where this property sits in the watershed, so the importance of this estate. So I'm reading this letter, and they're thanking the new owner, and I get to the end. It's not very long, maybe a page. And I'm wondering where the thank you is to my parents, the people who cared for the land for 50 years. And I start thinking again of all the people who've been always engaged, always have loved, have worked it, who have taken care of, but aren't engaged in the larger conversation, whether we're talking about environmental history or whether we're talking about contemporary environmental practices and what it is that we're going to do next. And what does that mean about the way we approach the topic, and how do we change that? So because I always like quotes, I'm going to end on 2 quotes. I usually say more. See, I told you I could say a lot, but I'm going to end on 2 quotes. Because I talk about what does it mean to take risks. And I don't mean a risk in order not to lose, but a risk to gain. You know, and a lot of that risk about how we show up and how we show up differently. One of the things with predominantly white environmental groups, I work with a lot of great people, well-intentioned people, who said, you know, well, what can we do? What can we do? I said, some of the stuff that you have to do is really hard to do. Your organization actually has to take stock. Your mission statements from 50 years ago might not be working today. It may mean that some of you, and I know this is really hard in your leadership positions, aren't the best people to do the work because you don't have the capacity or the competency, so it means you have to step aside and let someone else who is. Dr. Josita Taylor from the University of Michigan came out with what's called the Green 2.0 study, came out with it this summer, her and her team. And they looked at government institutions, organizations, environmental groups, and said, they looked at all the leadership and said the same problem is still there in terms of who's making the decision, that we're not seeing the diversity of the United States within these organizations still, even with everything that's been happening for 20 or 30 years by the environmental justice movement. And what does that mean? So my last 2 quotes, the first is from Albert Einstein, because like I always say, he's a really smart man. He says, you can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. You can't solve a problem with the same consciousness that created it. It's not simply about coming up with diversity and inclusion plans. It's not simply about adding things to your syllabus. I mean, these are all starting points and starting places, but there's some really deep level work that has to happen in there. And that's the really hard place to be. That's the place where we're all going to be uncomfortable. And some of us have always been uncomfortable because we live in that place. So what does it mean to really engage that? And even though I like Albert Einstein's quote, I prefer Mom's Mabley, who says, if you always do what you always did, you always get what you always got. Thank you. I went on too long.
So just like we always do, we have mics we're going to bring around if you have questions. You're not going to be on film, but we just want to make sure we capture the question, since you seem to be running out of voice to repeat the question.
I never. It only looks that way, but
okay.
That's okay.
All right, so just shoot up your hand and I'll bring you the mic, or Dr. Powers will, if you have a question.
Come on, give me a question, a thought. Don't be shy.
They're thinking.
Oh, wait, I know they're thinking.
Do you have one?
This really isn't a question, but this is just my impression. Like, I'm a political science major, and what you just said at the end, it just got me realizing about, like, well, a little backstory. I'm in courts and politics right now, and I was just thinking about the Supreme Court and, like, how, like, you know, they're supposed to protect the rights of the minorities, yet, like, again, trying to approach this with some sensitivity, like, the people, like, the 9 Supreme Court justices who head the Supreme Court, they aren't, like, I guess, reflective of the diversity that we have, because they're all, you know, again, sensitivity, you know, white people, they go to the elite schools, yet they're supposed to represent, like, the American people because they are the U.S. Supreme Court. This isn't, I guess, a question, it's just my impressions and
I think, Charles, did you get that? Did you get the question? Okay. I think that's true just about in every sector in the country, right? And this is not, again, I'm like you, it's not about white people are bad or something. It's not about that at all, but it's about understanding that you have people that have been privileged and that have largely come from a particular cultural experience that's incredibly diverse in and of itself. and have put forth a certain way of looking at life in the United States, whether it's politics, education, science, the way we know. And a lot of that has been amazing. And for me, it hasn't considered the real breadth of our experience as a much more diverse people. And because we know that all that wonderful creation and knowledge building has been going on at the same time as things like segregation have been going on, and racism and prejudice, and we're still having some of the same conversations we've been having for 100 years. We still have them, you know. All you got to do is watch the news every night to see, and you're seeing about a snippet of it. And so how do we change that? And this, for me, is where there's some resistance to that. I think that, you know, what are we willing to risk? You know, because you have to be willing to risk to show up. One of the things that I was telling John and Karen earlier is that in my department of 60 to 70 faculty, and in the College of, and then that's a department within the College of Natural Resources, I'm the only African American. And wait a minute, it gets better. Because they had recruited me, right? And there's the process over my tenure has gone over 2 years because of the fight over it. And largely because some people didn't, because it's, I try to be, not to sound like I'm defending myself, but it's a conversation about science versus social science and the humanities. It's a conversation about race and difference and who gets to speak to it. It's a conversation about methodology. How do we speak to it? So is it rigorous enough to write a book that's accessible or not? It's about a lack of legibility and understanding of what it means to be. It's people who don't want to be made uncomfortable. It's other people who just don't want to be in the conversation, so avoid the conversation. And what you just said is plain, it's all there. And I'm kind of looking at it going, the best thing that's happening about it is that everybody's having a conversation because a lot of people are angry and a lot of people just don't know what to do with this moment, what happens. Because for me, it's not about asking any of those people to leave. I believe there's actually room for everybody to be here and do the work. It's about standing in that tension of difference. And I may not know exactly what it is you do, but I can respect that. And it's like, and it's going to take me some time because I have to do that anyway. I'm showing up in your space as the only one. I have to do it anyway. I'm walking around a hallway where I'm reminded of it day in and day out that I'm the only one who looks like me here. So I know what it is. So all I ask is that actually you do the same thing because I'm willing to work with you. I'm interested in what it is you do. I'm interested in how we do this together, you know, what that means. But not everybody wants to do that, and not everybody knows how to do that, in all fairness. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for a great talk, and if I wasn't here for the conference, I would go out and buy your book tomorrow.
Thank you.
No, it was a great talk. I had two questions.
Yeah.
The first one, so your talk made me think of a sort of halfway related book, and it's a book called Making Technology Masculine by Ruth Oldenziel, and she talks about the ways in which, you know, the practice of engineering, but also the products of technology have been gendered in this country. And would it be correct to summarize what you're arguing here is that those kind of spaces that you talked about have been racialized, and they've been racialized as white? So what you just said about deep level work is really important because it's at a very deep level that state parks, national parks, gardens, estates, you know, have a white quality to them rather than a more inclusive one. And then can I ask a second question too? Okay.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
I was,
Yes.
The second question is, I was thinking of the work that Richard White has done in The Organic Machine, where he talks about knowing nature through labor.
Yeah.
And if you think about the African American experience in this country before, say, you know, 1900 or later, before the mechanization of agriculture, think of slavery, the Jim Crow South, then of course the people working in the fields were predominantly black. So in that respect, African Americans would know the land much better, would have known the land much better than the white counterparts.
Or I would say just know the land differently. You know, for me, it's less about who knows it better. I mean, I use the story of my parents because I think they knew it better than the Tishmans, because the Tishmans just weren't there every day. I think there's a way within which my parents just have become, and people like my parents, become invisible in the conversation altogether. The other thing I want to say is, and this is my hopefully somewhat informed opinion, that we collectively largely talk about the environment and natural resources in two ways. We either see them as a place where we recreate or a supermarket of resources. And actually, you know, there's multiple ways, right, to engage and think of place and natural resources, and we look at different cultural groups who have historically engaged these spaces different, whether it's because they think they're sacred space, whether they work the land, I mean, all the different ways there, but it's sort of not counted in the primary conversation here. There was something about the first thing you said, now I forgot, but it was good. Racialized spaces, yes, I know it. So what I want to say, and I'm always really careful about saying, I mean, the title of the book is Black Faces, White Spaces, because I was up there trying to be all provocative. I gave a talk last week at the University of Minnesota, and a man who's a white man from Poland, who's I forgot what he said he does, he's an academic there, but he stood up in the back and he was really upset. And because he says, well, I'm a white, and I feel like you're talking about all white, and I'm getting angry. And, you know, it was really difficult for me to explain to him about systemic racism and understanding that it's less about me pointing fingers at anybody, because I could argue in many ways we all may have been complicit in some way or another, right? It's more about understanding what's systemic about a larger process, and that unearned privilege. Well, I believe we all have privilege. We all just don't have the same privilege. But unearned privilege and skin color. I said, you and I can walk into the room and you've immediately earned something that from nothing. You've got, just because you showed up looking a way and I look another way. And we had a great conversation later because Poland has its own particular history of oppression and me kind of understanding, and he hasn't been in the United States very long in that complication. So for me, when I say a white space, it's just to say when I think of John Muir and Roosevelt, you know, standing in front of Yosemite and making a decision about this is going to be a wilderness area, this is going to represent the United States in a particular way, they privileged their way of seeing, perceiving, and being able to be in that space, and they happen to be white men doing it. You know, it doesn't make them bad, but it does, you know, when you start looking at sort of the impact your originally European culture as a whole has had on shaping this country from the beginning, it's hard to forget that, it's hard for me to forget, you know, all the native people who have been killed, moved from their land, who are still fighting for the right to be in certain places the way they are, how enslaved people were enslaved to build our economy, who started our economy. For me, you cannot forget that. I know we're at a different place now, but there's a legacy, and these things are connected in a very particular way. So yes, to what you were saying. That was my long yes. Okay.
Hi, I'm Evandra from the African American Studies Department, and my question, or more so my analysis of what you were talking about, kind of comes to environment, economics, and commerce. So here in Virginia, especially in Richmond, we were like one of the busiest slave trade areas. But a lot of the African American communities here were kind of torn apart due to like commerce and like economics. And I guess with the environment, how does one preserve a history, but while preserving that history, it could stifle commerce or economics? And especially in black spaces, like here, Jackson Ward was kind of tore apart through Highway 95, been put through it during urban renewal. Or, you know, there's an ongoing discussion here on whether or not we should put a stadium in our downtown area near our African burial grounds. I mean, like, where does it become an area where you kind of have to come to a compromise on when do you let economics go over preservation, or is it strictly, it should be always preservation afterwards, I guess?
That's a great question. Oh my God, who put you in here to ask that question? So I like to think of preservation broadly defined. So you're speaking, and I'm thinking about all the ways that we preserve our memories and preserve our stories. And partly what I'm hearing from that real material, we go into it, we look at this place right here, and we change it, you know. So do we either save this place as it is, or do we change it so people have more job opportunity? I think each place, as a geographer, I said has its own specific characteristic and identity and set of stakeholders, and so I don't think you can make a blanket assumption, I can't blanketly answer that for every single space. Having said that, for me there's multiple ways to preserve the memory of that place. And it doesn't always mean, ooh, I hope those in the room who disagree, don't forgive me a little bit, that the actual place has to be preserved as is. Because I started off this conversation by saying everything changes, right? And so part of it is how we show up and lean into that change. What I understand is the loss that's inherent in that. And when you're talking about communities that have felt that loss all their lives anyway, it becomes compounded. So for then it becomes about how do you address that loss? And understand that when you come into somebody's community who's been largely invisible, that they're fighting for something more than simply that place. For them, it's another moment where they're saying, oh my God, again. So now you want to erase this about who we are too. So it points to, for me, not necessarily necessarily just the focusing on preserving that place, but actually looking at what lies underneath and the need, what is driving that need for that preservation and what is driving that resistance. And I think if you can start a conversation there, then that compromise might become a little more easy, if that's the right word. People might have more of an ability to come to that moment and have that conversation. Does that make sense?
Doesn't make sense.
Yes, no.
I'm sorry. I'm taking over.
No,
Thank you. She was nodding. She was nodding. Yeah, we were. Yeah.
So I wanted to follow up on that actually, because it's a really smart question, and you said something in your response there that I was thinking about during your talk.
Yeah.
It's this whole language of stakeholders.
Yeah.
That is driving me
Crazy.
absolutely
Me too.
nuts at the
Me
moment.
too. I know.
To me, that narrows the discussion about climate change and what we could possibly do to address some of the challenges that face us, that are multifaceted challenges that need multifaceted and creative responses. And to me, the language of stakeholders limits the possibilities that the creativity and the possible solutions. I wonder if you could speak to that.
Well, I can, and I know I use the term, and I try not. There's certain words I try not to use, but often for lack of words that I know are recognizable. So, part of it is, I think I mentioned earlier, I don't use the term outreach anymore. The term outreach, minority, there's just terms that make me crazy, right? As somebody who's been outreached to in my life, because for me, outreach came from a good place and I believe it came from a well-intended place. But what outreach means is that I can outreach to you, I'm gonna bring you to my table, you're gonna learn everything that I'm doing, and I actually don't have to change. I just have to make a little place for you here. Come and sit down. Okay, I'm being kind of facetious, but not really. And I'm more interested in relationships of reciprocity. And a relationship of reciprocity with you is something different, because it means I actually have to change too, even if I seem to be in the more powerful position because I have the resources and what have you. But it still means I actually have to shift and do some of the work. You don't have to do all the work yourself. And what I also don't like about stakeholder, I understand that people have to find a way, people who have a stake in, but it sort of takes away the humanity. And the thing that you're pointing to, too, is about, for me, it's frustration around how to get creative. So when I think about, nonprofit organizations, people who do work on policy, when I think about academic institutions, we are also bounded by the rigidity of our own rules and our ways to evaluate. So I'll go into a nonprofit group and they're saying, yeah, we're really interested in diversity and inclusion. We're doing this work in this community on X, Y, and Z environmental, but we only have 1 year because that's as long as the funding will last. And I'm like, dude, I never say that really, but I say that, this is not something you do in a calendar year. You have to be committed. It is a process. There is no end game to working in terms of difference and being able to really engage that. And I understand they don't have enough money, so then they can't do it, right? So the rules will keep them there. It's the same way about, you talk about creativity, but how do we evaluate, so I'm looking at a lot of folks here that I'm guessing are professors, so how do you evaluate that in terms of standards? What does that look like? In terms of if we're going to be creative and innovative? Is it drawing on the canon of theory and methodology, but what if we're trying something different? And how long are we allowed to be in that place of difference where we're going to make mistakes, but we got to try it out in order to get at that creativity? There's something else I was going to say there, man. I was on a stream of consciousness, but I lost it, but it'll come back. Hi,
I'm Raina Smith. I'm an International Social Justice and African American Studies major. Your answer to Evangeline's question, just another loss, like communities who have suffered loss after loss after loss, reminded me of Ta-Nehisi's his case for reparations.
Yes.
So my question is, if we're changing somebody's space, is a conversation about reparations enough? Or do we actually do some reparations need to be paid?
If we're changing somebody's space.
Yeah, if we're coming in and we're changing somebody's space as just another one of their losses, is talking about reparations enough? Like, is that where we stop?
Wow.
Or do we actually need to do something?
Oh, we actually need to do something.
Okay.
Sorry. I know. The case for reparations, I think, is a really complicated one. I mean, I feel like I understand it in my gut and in my heart what it means, and I think there are a lot of people who need to be reparations need to be made. And we live in terms of what that reparation looks like, you know, we live in a different place in terms of, you know, land isn't going to be, I mean, it's so complicated, this idea that we give land or money. I don't know that we could ever figure that out. I think we could take all that energy, instead of trying to figure that out, and really figure out how we change the way we're doing things right now. This is work for me, practice and praxis, what that actually looks like. And it comes back to, you know, everything, our rules. President Clinton about 4 or 5 years ago came to Berkeley and gave a talk, and regardless of how you feel about him politically, first of all, that man is an incredible orator. If you've never seen him in person, man, I was sitting in the balcony, I was like, he was talking about everything, but the thing that stuck with me is he said, you know, for developing countries, what they need is infrastructure. He said, but for countries like the United States, the biggest problem we have is the rigidity of our institutions. And man, it really struck home for me, because it's like moving the Titanic, whether you're talking about the National Park Service, a big government agency, whether you're talking about an academic institution. Our institutions were built historically at a very particular time, and I understand we came up with standards and ways of thinking about and creating knowledge and who gets to participate. And we're at a time where we're still looking at college campuses and looking about what their makeup is, what kind of work we're doing. When we talk about, you know when work gets more creative? When we have more people involved. For me, when you have two people, and I keep using her because she's like right here, you know, and we're two different people, it is not, for me, just what she's going to do that's exciting or just what I'm going to do, but the possibility of what emerges from a third space, because within our difference, we have that tension. Exactly, and I always say to people, tension is energy. It's not a bad thing, right? And somebody said to me once, when you got a butterfly comes out of the cocoon. If it didn't have its tension, the butterfly would die. That's what tension is. So how do we put our energy towards getting better at standing in that tension and having that conversation across difference? If we go there, I think then we'll start moving forward. You can tell I feel strongly about it.